And this does depend on your situation somewhat. You know, what type of beekeeper are you? This is actually a picture of me out with some of the guys I was working out in Montana with. They had a 10,000 hive operation going on out there. And, you know, certainly, you know, what goes on with these guys versus what would go on with a backyard beekeeper with, you know, a hive or two would be a different situation. So it largely depends on the type of beekeeper, you know, what your goals are, what you're doing with your bees, how you can apply biosecurity, what's practical to you and what's not. And certainly, you may not be able to do everything, you know, especially with migratory beekeeping, where they're moving bees all over the place, that can get pretty difficult. But it's also very important to apply it whenever you can. And that what I'll say is that something is always better than nothing. Whatever you can do is going to at least reduce risks for your bees and hazards for your bees' health. So my recommendation is to sit down and think about your situation, what your goals are, what's practical for you, and do your best to consider this. You know, if you're at that point, you're already ahead of where many people are. So I'm going to give you 10 tips of ways to kind of start this process in your mind and when you're thinking about addressing biosecurity in your own bee yards. So number one here is hive assessments. And this is one thing that I observed, and I observed a lot of beekeepers in the last few years all over the world in all different types of situations. So I really got to know how a lot of people do a lot of different things, which has been a really interesting study for me and given me some interesting perspectives. And one thing that I've noticed that was fairly common with a lot of beekeepers, even beekeepers that are experienced beekeepers that have been doing it for quite some time, know how to do hive assessments. And that's inspections, exams, whatever you want to call it. And not just flipping the lid and looking for white wax and saying, okay, it looks good, it's clean fit. And that's appropriate sometimes, but knowing, you know, what's actually going on in your hives and not being afraid to go in and do an assessment. I see a lot of beekeepers that just kind of fly around, peek real quick. They're terrified that they're going to kill the queen if they even breathe on their hive. And you really just can't be that way. You have to, you know, be confident and know how to do a hive assessment. And what I tell my students, you know, when it comes to bees, when it comes to anatomy, I teach a lot of health students, pre-health students, and they all want to know what disease is, right? They already know, they want to see some kind of gross picture that I can throw up on the screen for them about some disease. And it's like, well, guys, you know, how you know abnormal is by looking at normal and looking at normal and looking at normal until you get so good at looking at normal that when you see abnormal, you might not know exactly what it is, but you sure know it's not right. And that's one of the first steps to being a really good assessor and learning how to diagnose what's going on whenever there is a problem. So how do you do that? Well, again, getting in your hives, spending a little bit of time. You know, I'm not saying you have to spend an hour in every hive. You know, if you have so many hives, it may not be practical, but especially at the beginning, you know, get to know what should be going on in that hive. And there's two other things that you have to do in learning how to do these assessments. One is you have to know what normal bee biology is. Know bee biology, study it like the back of your hand, learn bee math, right? Hopefully some of you more experienced beekeepers know what that bee math is, you know, what your queen should be doing, how long it takes for developmental time of different types of brood, and what you should be looking for in the season. You know, what you see in the spring is not the same as what you see in the fall, you know, and normal can change in those different seasons. You should be so confident of that so that when you know what normal is, you should be able to pick up abnormal, and don't be afraid to do it. If you're afraid of opening your hive that you're going to kill a queen, well, you know, it can happen, probably happen to everybody, but if you do, learn how to fix it. Have some resources, you know, have friends or people you can buy a queen from, or have more than one hive. You know, even if you're a backyard beekeeper, it sure does help to have more than one hive so that you can kind of help each other. Maybe even rear your own queens, and that kind of gets into The second thing there is how to assess your bees. Your bees are probably one of the bigger ways you can bring disease threats into your yard. And some of this you can control, and of course some of it you can't. I mean, you can't control where they're going to go fly, right? They're going to go fly 3 miles or so radius and back, and they don't always tell you where they're coming from, right? But you can control when you bring in new stock into your yards. And that's across the board. That's whether you're talking about bees or whether you're talking about cattle, whether you're talking about hogs or whatever you're talking about. You never, ever, ever just plop a load of hogs, new hogs into a yard. Never would you see that happen in any other agricultural animal. But in bees, you'll go off, you'll go get some nukes, bring them in, friends bees, feral bees, a swarm, bring them right in, new queens. I would caution you to be careful with that and make sure, that you're really assessing what's going on with that new stock that you're bringing in. Making sure that they're clean. Maybe if you have a yard, and some beekeepers do this, some bigger beekeepers that have multiple yards do this. They actually have a new stock yard. They have a nuke yard where they keep them separate from maybe their honey hives. And that way they can, if something would go wrong, they could limit it to one area. So this kind of spread out thing that I have here, that may or may not be practical for you, but if you have multiple yards, it's good that they are spread out, that you don't have too many bees in one basket, if you will, so that if you have a crisis that occurs in one yard, you're at least a couple miles away, 2, 3, or further is even better, miles away, so that, if that yard would happen to have an issue, a problem, or a quarantine, it wouldn't affect all of your yards. Ooh, we're split on this one. Good. Okay. Well, I would say that the trues are going to win out here, and they do, and that would be really not what I would suggest for you guys, okay? Alcohol, and this is there's a reason why I put this in here. Alcohol is one of those great myths, not just in bees, but in medicine in general. And maybe you guys have experienced this. You go and you get a shot or something, or they're taking blood or something. They take a little alcohol swab and they dab it on, and that makes you sterile. No, not at all. Okay, is it for show? Yes, it absolutely is, and it has nothing to do with aseptic technique. Okay, so that's some insider information for you. Alcohol, we do use it somewhat in surgical preps after we scrub for about 5 minutes and leave soap in contact. It's all about contact time on skin when we're doing surgical preps. And then we'll douse it with alcohol and let it sit on the skin for a period of time. So it's the contact time, and it's in use with other things for skin. So, alcohol itself is not going to disinfect hive tools. I mean, could you wipe it off? Sure, we could wipe it off with water and you'd remove some of the physical debris, but alcohol isn't necessarily, a douse of alcohol isn't necessarily going to reduce greatly a lot of our pathogens. So one of the best ways that you can actually clean, and when I say clean, I mean disinfect and remove as many pathogens as you can practically in the bee yard, is to put your hive tool in your smoker. Okay, fire is a pretty good disinfector, and it's one of the more practical ones we have out in our bee yards. So if you can, or even your torch, be careful, you're not going to burn yourself, but burning off, torching off, putting it in your smoker is really the better way to disinfect that. If you want to wipe it off with alcohol afterwards, just to kind of clean off some of the propolis and things of that nature, that can help, but really you want to burn it. Now, be careful, don't use alcohol and then put it in your hive, in your smoker. then you might have some fire, but be careful with that. But use your smoker. Go ahead with question 7.
Okay, I think I have 7, 8, and 9 here together. It has to do with record keeping, also multiple hive yards. Sick hives should be inspected first. Okay, I'll go with this and you could fill it in. Here we go.
I just answer question number 1 there.
Okay.
Can we do that?
It's going to require all 3 answers in order to submit.
Okay, they can go ahead and answer them. You can.
I'll give you another 20 seconds. Just go ahead and answer all the questions. I could relaunch it.
All right, number 1, I'm kind of proud of you on this one. It says allowing bees to rob out your wet, your extracted supercomposed the risk to biosecurity. And this is one thing we commonly all do. Makes for easy cleanup, and I very guilty of this. But man, I don't know if you guys had problems with robbing this kind of late summer and into this fall. I really think that the drought had a lot to do with it. But if you think about what robbing behavior does and what it kind of induces with bees, I mean, maybe you could say, well, it's just my bees robbing out my own bees and they're all sharing their own things. And you're right, if you're just sharing things within your own yard, that's not as much of a biosecurity risk. At least whatever disease you may have, you're keeping to yourself. However, you can't really guarantee that with bees whenever they're flying around for a 3-mile radius or so. I mean, if you know everybody that's in your 3-mile radius and that's just you, that's fine. But in Pennsylvania, that's rarely the case. So, when you're putting out those supers to be robbed, you may be inducing all of the neighbors' bees and people that maybe you don't know about. There's certainly a lot of beekeepers that are off the grid and their bees could be coming in. Or you could be having some feral bees coming in and robbing out those supers and bringing in whatever goes along with it. So, it's a common practice, but it is a little bit of a risk when it comes to biosecurity. Awesome. Good job on the record keeping. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I have to tell you guys, and maybe you guys are all good about this, but in my travels, most beekeepers, record keeping wasn't always the top thing that they were involved in doing. So I did see a lot of improvement for record keeping. I'll talk a little bit about that. It looks like you guys got that answer correct there. And then in multiple hive yards, I say sick hives should be inspected first. And that is absolutely false. You're right on that. You want to actually save them to last, because if you know you have a sick hive, you don't want to go into that hive and then afterwards inspect the other hives and potentially spread it. You want to save it to last if you possibly know about that. All right, so getting back to the 10 tips on equipment. So another thing that you should assess whenever you're looking at your biosecurity in your yard. If you can do an all-in, no-out approach, that's really the best thing to do if you can pull that off. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, that means that whatever's coming into that yard, be it equipment, be it the bees, whatever it is that you're bringing into that yard, you don't move it to another yard. You keep it all in that yard. So again, using designated equipment for that yard, designated supers, frames, things of that nature. And the only thing that you bring into that yard would be new equipment, and that you're not bringing in equipment from other yards or used equipment, especially that you're not sure of, especially if it's not your own. Another thing with equipment is to rotate frames. And I've heard different beekeepers talk about this. I know it's certainly a topic that you guys go over, but keeping track of your frames can seem like a daunting task. They just tend to get all over the place and accumulate, and especially this time of year, if you're combining hives or whatever. But one thing that I do that I think is a pretty easy tip is I'll take a marker and I'll mark the top of my wooden frame with a year. So, 20 or 19 or, whatever year it is. And that way I can kind of keep track of when that frame was first used in the hive. And that is a good way of helping to age frames. So you can look in and you can see if that hive or that frame has been in that hive for so many years. After 3 years is really when they talk about wanting to rotate frames out. And that has to do with the wax itself. And I know we love drawn comb, right? It's such a resource, but over time, that wax tends to build up things like pesticides into the wax. You can also get disease. So you don't want to keep frames around longer than necessary. And you really should be rotating those out about every 3 years. Some guys will go as far as 5, but really 3 is probably the better recommendation. And when you're thinking about things coming into your yard, you should even consider your vehicles. And some people might think this is extreme, but this is in every biosecurity protocol that's written by every kind of government facility out there for all types of agricultural animals and for bees in all the other countries, is even the vehicles coming in. If you think about what a vehicle can bring in, and to be honest, my car needs swap out right now. It needs clean, but it can bring in a lot of material. It can bring in dirt and dust and things with it that can carry pathogens with it. So if you can keep your vehicles a little bit away from your yards, if you can park and then kind of go up, and I know you like to, it's harder sometimes to carry things if you're dropping things off, but trying to have a designated area for vehicles or not allowing more vehicles in your yard, maybe not have a big party in your yard with lots of vehicles, that can keep things away and out of your bee yard. 4th tip here, again, is sanitation and disposal. And I think this is something that, and certainly I'm guilty, and we can absent-mindedly do this whenever we're scraping off frames. We just let the, maybe drone brood or burr comb or whatever we're scraping off, just be kind of thrown on the ground. And that's really not a good practice, or old propolis or whatever we're scraping on. And this is, easy to do, simple to say, but I think it's actually harder to sometimes get yourself to do it. But, it involves something as simple as just a garbage bag and making sure that you're scraping things off and you're collecting any of those debris pieces that could come out of your hive, and clean it up and dispose of it in a way that the bees aren't going to get into it, okay, or you're not going to attract robbers into your yard. So that can be, again, pretty inexpensive and simple to do. It's just a matter of forming that habit to do it. And then finally, burning is also a good way to sanitize just about anything in your yard. Certainly, we don't want to get to a point where we have to burn any hives, but I've certainly been in a lot of yards where there's a lot of old equipment laying around, and old equipment that is really dilapidated and just, you're never going to use it again. It's just kind of sitting there. You really should clean that up, have a bonfire and kind of clean up and get rid of those things. And burning is the best way to do that. Now, you do have to know if you can burn things. You may not be in a situation where you can burn things on site. Maybe you have certain burning ordinances or things. But if you can't burn it there, if there's another place and you could kind of pack those things up securely and get rid of them, that would be a better way than just having them kind of out in your yard. And then finally, I have this economics there at the bottom, and that's to remind me to say, again, you don't have to do all of these things, but little things that you can do, they can be very, inexpensive to do if you just take little steps. And again, it's just little changes in our behavior and our habits and doing these things. And if you can save your hives from having a greater disease load or a greater pesticide load, that'll save you and your bees in the long run.